It's 11 p.m. on December 2nd, 1984, and Bhopal is asleep. 500,000 people spread across the low hills and crowded lanes of this central Indian city have gone to bed early. Street vendors have folded their carts. Children are tucked in. In the dense, working-class neighborhoods that press up against the northern edge of town, Jay Prakash Nagar, Chola, Kazi Camp, families sleep 4 and 5 to a room, windows cracked against the winter chill. Less than a kilometer from those sleeping families, on the edge of the city, sits a factory. Floodlit, fenced, and mostly quiet. A Union Carbide plant that makes pesticides. In a few minutes, a pressure gauge inside that plant will begin climbing. Nobody will stop it in time. By morning, the streets outside those cracked windows will be lined with the dead. To understand what happened in Bhopal, you need to understand what methyl isocyanate is. MIC, as chemists call it, is a colorless liquid that becomes a gas almost instantly when exposed to air. It is roughly 500 times more toxic than hydrogen cyanide. When inhaled, it attacks the lungs, the eyes, the nervous system, and the reproductive organs simultaneously. There is no antidote. Exposure doesn't just kill, it dismantles the body systematically from the inside out. It was used at the Bhopal plant as an intermediate step in manufacturing 7, a widely used insecticide. Union Carbide's plant in the United States, in Institute, West Virginia, also used MIC. But crucially, it didn't store large quantities of it. It made MIC in small batches, only as needed, and immediately converted it. The Bhopal plant did things differently. 3 massive underground tanks, each capable of holding 68,000 liters, were filled with liquid MIC. At the time of the disaster, Tank 610 alone held 42 metric tons. That decision, to store enormous quantities of one of the most dangerous chemicals on Earth in an already struggling plant, in a densely populated city, in a country whose workers had fewer protections than their American counterparts, was made not by scientists. It was made by accountants. Union Carbide had entered India with high hopes in the late 1960s. The Green Revolution had created a booming market for pesticides. The company leased land on the outskirts of Bhopal and built a factory. In the beginning, the plant simply imported its most dangerous components from the United States and assembled the final product locally. But profits were disappointing. Indian farmers, struggling with debt and drought, couldn't afford Union Carbide's products. By the early 1980s, the Bhopal plant was running at roughly a quarter of its intended capacity. It was a losing venture. The corporation's response was not to close the plant or redesign it. The response was to cut costs and to keep cutting. What followed was a systematic dismantling of safety. Between 1980 and 1984, the workforce was reduced by half. Operators who had trained for years were replaced by trainees. The number of workers assigned to the MIC plant dropped from 12 per shift to 6. In the control room, a single operator was now responsible for monitoring 70 panels, indicators, and controllers. In July 1984, 5 months before the disaster, Union Carbide's own engineers in the United States sent an internal report warning that the Bhopal safety systems were inadequate. The report specifically flagged the risk of a runaway reaction in the MIC storage tanks. It recommended that all operating personnel worldwide be warned about the contamination risk. No such warning was ever issued to Bhopal. 7 of the plant's safety systems were either broken or switched off at the time of the disaster. The flare tower, designed to burn off escaping gas, had been shut down for maintenance and never restarted. The vent gas scrubber, which would have neutralized escaping MIC with caustic soda, had been turned off to conserve electricity. The refrigeration unit that kept MIC cool and stable, also offline. Switched off months earlier to save money. 70% of the plant's employees had been fined at some point for refusing to cut corners on safety procedures. One worker staged a 15-day hunger strike to protest conditions. He was fired. The Bhopal plant was not waiting for an accident to happen. It had been manufacturing the conditions for one, step by step, for years. At 10:45 p.m. on December 2nd, a worker noticed water leaking from a pipe near tank 610. He reported it to his supervisor. The supervisor, according to later testimony, told him it was probably just rainwater seeping through a faulty seal. He said he would look at it after his tea break. At 11:30 p.m., workers noticed the pressure inside tank 610 rising. It was at 2 pounds per square inch. Normal operating pressure was near zero. Within 30 minutes, it would be over 40 pounds per square inch, far beyond the tank's design limit. By that point, the MIC was already superheating, the tank was rumbling, and the temperature inside had climbed to over 200 degrees Celsius. Water had gotten into the tank. When water and MIC combine, they produce a violent exothermic reaction. The reaction generates heat. The heat turns liquid MIC into expanding, boiling gas. The gas needs somewhere to go. At 12:15 a.m. on December 3rd, a safety valve on tank 610 blew. 27 tons of methyl isocyanate gas erupted into the night air of Bhopal. Aziza Sultan was asleep in her home in Jai Prakash Nagar. She woke at approximately 12:30 a.m. to the sound of her baby coughing. In the half-light, she later recalled, I saw that the room was filled with a white cloud. I heard a lot of people shouting. They were shouting, "Run, run!" Then I started coughing, with each breath seeming as if I was breathing in fire. My eyes were burning. Champa Devi Shukla, another survivor, remembers the sensation this way. It felt like somebody had filled our bodies with red chilies. Our eyes had tears coming out. Noses were watering. We had froth in our mouths. The coughing was so bad that people were writhing in pain. Some people just got up and ran in whatever they were wearing, or even if they were wearing nothing at all. People were only concerned as to how they would save their lives. The gas was heavier than air. It traveled low to the ground, exactly at breathing height. It hugged the streets and crept through window cracks and door frames. It found people in their beds and killed them there. It found people in the street and killed them running. The neighborhoods closest to the plant, the poorest neighborhoods where workers and their families lived, absorbed the worst of it. Bano B, a 32-year-old woman who lived directly adjacent to the plant, stumbled out of her home. Within the year following that night, her husband was dead. Over the following months, 4 of her children died. I was left behind to bear the burden, she later said. 40 years on, she still lives in Bhopal, still suffering from what doctors now call Bhopal gas disease, a condition of chronic multi-system illness with no cure. 4-year-old Bati Bairajik remembered people running. Her eyes burned. Her family stayed inside, covered with wet blankets. An uncle who worked at the Union Carbide factory had once told them what to do if a leak ever happened. Her father covered each of his children. Somehow the night passed, she said decades later. In the morning when we went outside, there were so many people who were dead on the streets. By dawn, the roads of Bhopal looked like a battlefield with no enemy in sight. People lay where they had fallen. Animals, cattle, dogs, birds were dead in the streets. At the railway station, the station master died at his desk, still at his post, having spent his last minutes trying to stop incoming trains from bringing passengers into the gas cloud. Municipal workers who collected bodies, loading them onto trucks by hand, later described moving at least 15,000 corpses in those first days. Many were buried in mass graves. Many were cremated without identification. In the poorest neighborhoods, where residents were migrants, workers without documentation, people who had no official existence, they died and were counted as no one. The official Indian government death toll stands at 2,259 immediate deaths. Union Carbide has cited approximately 3,800. The real number is something the world has never been allowed to know. Municipal workers counted 15,000 bodies. Survivor organizations tracking deaths from gas-related diseases over the following decades estimated 23,000 by 2011. Amnesty International concluded that more than 22,000 people have died as a direct result of the disaster. Historians who call Bhopal the Hiroshima of the chemical industry are not exaggerating. More than 500,000 people were exposed to the gas. Of those, an estimated 150,000 are still suffering from chronic illness more than 40 years later. The gas attacked every system it touched. Survivors developed lung disease, nerve damage, cataracts, kidney failure, and cancers at dramatically elevated rates. Women who survived reported epidemic rates of menstrual disorders, premature menopause, stillbirths, and reproductive failure. A landmark study published in the British Medical Journal in 2023 found a fourfold increase in miscarriages among exposed populations, elevated rates of neonatal mortality, and a measurable decline in male births in the year following the disaster. Effects radiating across a 100-kilometer radius. Then there are the children. Children born to gas-exposed parents who were never in Bhopal on the night of December 2nd. Children born years later to mothers whose DNA had been irreparably damaged by MIC exposure. One study found them developing at lower rates, suffering higher rates of learning disabilities, immune disorders, and cancers. Sanjay Verma, who was 5 months old when the gas leak occurred and lost his parents, siblings, and eventually his brother Sunil to the disaster's long psychological trauma, put it simply decades later. We, the people of Bhopal, believe the whole world has transformed into a Bhopal in a way. Multinational corporations are being allowed to do business without accountability, poisoning the world and placing profits over people. Warren Anderson was 63 years old and serving as chairman and CEO of Union Carbide Corporation when the gas escaped Tank 610. He flew to Bhopal on December 7th, 4 days after the disaster. He was arrested on arrival by Madhya Pradesh police on charges of causing death by negligence. He was taken to a Union Carbide guest house. 6 hours later, having posted bail of $2,100, roughly what one Bhopal family would receive 25 years later as full and final compensation, he was released. A government plane flew him out of Bhopal that same day. He returned to the United States. He never came back. In 1987, the Indian government formally charged Anderson with culpable homicide, the equivalent of manslaughter, along with 8 other executives. In response, Union Carbide stated that the company was not under Indian jurisdiction. The charges in India carry a maximum sentence of 10 years in prison. In 2002, investigative journalists from the Greenpeace organization and the British Daily Mirror located Warren Anderson. He was living in a luxury home in the Hamptons, New York. Retired, comfortable, wealthy. In 2003, India delivered formal extradition papers to the United States Department of Justice. The Justice Department sat on them for nearly a year. Then, in 2004, it declined to extradite Anderson. Warren Anderson died in September 2014, weeks before the disaster's 30th anniversary, in a Florida nursing home. He had lived a long retirement. He had never stood trial for anything. He had never served a single day in prison. In 2010, 26 years after the disaster, 7 Indian nationals who had been employees of Union Carbide's Indian subsidiary were convicted of causing death by negligence. The maximum sentence allowed under Indian law for the charge, 2 years in prison. All 7 were released on bail the same day their convictions were announced. Not a single American executive, not the corporation itself, not Warren Anderson. 0 prison sentences for the people who made the decisions that filled those tanks. In 1989, without consulting a single survivor, the Indian government and Union Carbide Corporation reached a settlement before the Indian Supreme Court. Union Carbide would pay $470 million, roughly 15% of the initial amount the Indian government itself had sought. The Supreme Court approved it. Divided among the hundreds of thousands of claimants, this worked out to approximately $500 per person. $500 for a lifetime of damaged lungs, for dead children, for genetic damage passed to grandchildren not yet born, for a disease with no cure and no end. And UCC got something in exchange, a full and final release from all civil and criminal liability. The company announced that it was satisfied the settlement was fair. It continued operating. In 2001, Dow Chemical Company acquired Union Carbide. Dow was swift to honor other inherited liabilities, setting aside $2.2 billion to compensate former Union Carbide asbestos workers in Texas. For Bhopal, Dow has maintained consistently that it bears no responsibility. It acquired the assets, not the obligations. It has never cleaned the site. It has never paid additional compensation. As of today, more than 400 tons of toxic waste remain on the abandoned factory grounds in Bhopal. Groundwater beneath the site is contaminated with lead, mercury, and organochlorines. In 2004, India's Supreme Court ordered the state government to provide clean drinking water to residents because the groundwater was no longer safe. A 2002 study found mercury and organochlorines in the breast milk of women living near the plant. A generation of children born near the factory, long after 1984, has been found to suffer from elevated rates of birth defects, developmental delays, and cancers. They were not alive on December 2, 1984. They were never exposed to the gas. The poison is in the ground beneath their homes. In the summer of 2024, 40 years after the disaster, 2 women from Bhopal, both survivors, both advocates, toured cities across the United States. They met with environmental justice groups, university students, and lawmakers. They told their stories. One of them, Rachna Dhingra, said what survivors have been saying for 4 decades, that the $470 million settlement was negotiated without their knowledge or consent, that thousands of children gas-exposed in the womb were never registered as claimants and received nothing, that Union Carbide withheld critical toxicological data about MIC in the days immediately following the disaster, information that doctors needed to treat the dying, on the grounds that it was a trade secret. Union Carbide and its successor, Dow Chemical, still classify that data as proprietary. Doctors treating Bhopal survivors in 2024 still do not have access to the full chemical analysis of what was in that gas cloud. Rashida B., a survivor who has lost 5 family members to gas-related cancers, once said, "Those who escape with their lives are the unlucky ones. The lucky ones are those who died on that night." She is still alive. She is still fighting. She has never received adequate compensation. No one responsible has ever been punished in a meaningful way. The Bhopal disaster was the world's worst industrial accident. It wasn't an accident. Union Carbide knew the Bhopal plant was running on a skeleton crew. They knew safety systems were offline. They knew from their own internal July 1984 report that the MIC tanks could catastrophically fail. They knew the plant was located inside a city of 800,000 people. They knew they were storing tens of tons of one of the most toxic substances ever created in close proximity to 500,000 sleeping human beings. And they knew that the standards they applied in Bhopal were not the standards they applied in Institute, West Virginia. The plant in France that made the same pesticide never stored MIC at all. It made only what was needed in small batches. The Union Carbide plant in West Virginia had community notification protocols, emergency response plans, and functional safety systems. They were legally required to have them. Bhopal had none of that. Not because the technology didn't exist, because the technology was expensive, and the workers were Indian, and the families sleeping nearby were poor. And the calculation, implicit, never written down, perfectly understood, was that their lives were worth less. 15,000 people dead, 500,000 poisoned, 3 generations of children born sick, 400 tons of toxic waste still leaking into the soil, 1 settlement for $500 per person, 0 executives in prison. Union Carbide called what happened in Bhopal an industrial accident. But accidents happen when something goes wrong that no one anticipated. They turned off the safety systems themselves. They fired the workers who complained. They ignored the engineers who warned them. They flew the CEO home before he could be charged. They settled without the survivors' consent. They classified the toxicology data as a trade secret. And 40 years later, Bano Bai still wakes up every morning in Jai Prakash Nagar, the neighborhood closest to the plant, still suffering from every symptom in the list of Bhopal gas disease, still watching her grandson attend a school for children with developmental delays. He was born in 2012. 28 years after the gas escaped Tank 610, he was never there. The poison was.